Every year we do a fairy tale month, and every year we do a special fairy tale program. And this year we have chosen to do food stories. Now, I know you all know the gingerbread boy, you know the little red hen. These are all folk tales and fairy tales that you're familiar with. We're going to be telling you stories that you may never have heard of before. Oh, one of the stories you've heard of before, but it's not going to be quite the same story that you're used to. And we do have some books on display up here that if you want to know more about the story, you can check them out. If not today, then another time. So we're going to have some stories about food. And the story that I've chosen to tell comes from this book called The Goblin's Giggle, also found in this one called Even More Short and Shivery. The name of the story is Mary Culhane and the Dead Man. And I have with me an authentic blackthorn walking stick, which plays a prominent role in the story. I just wanted you to see what one looks like before we get started. Mary Culhane lived with her family on the other side of the graveyard. One night, her father stopped to rest after work by the side of a new-dug grave. He didn't realize it at the time, but he left his walking stick by the grave. As he was sitting down to supper, he said, "Oh!" His wife said, "What's wrong?" He says, "I've left my new blackthorn walking stick by the side of a new-dug grave, and I'm afraid the gypsies will take it, for it is a fine shillelagh." A shillelagh is a big, stout stick. All the other children thought of the haunted tombs and looked down at their plates. But Mary Culhane stood up and said, "I'll get it for you, Father." And she ran out into the night. She walked a ways until she came to the graveyard, and there she saw her father's blackthorn walking stick standing stark and bare against the gray-green of the graveyard grass. She went up to it and reached her hand out, but before she could grab hold, a voice called to her from the grave. "Stay your hand, Mary Culhane, touch not that stick, but come and open my coffin." Mary Culhane shivered, and Mary Culhane shook, but she felt compelled to lift the lid of the casket, and then she looked down into the dull, lifeless eyes of the dead man. "Take me upon your back, Mary Culhane," said he, but she was so paralyzed with fear she could not move an inch. So the dead man climbed out of the grave himself, and upon her back put his cold, clammy hands around her neck and bade her carry him to the town. Mary walked with his dead weight upon her back till she felt she could walk no further. But when she stopped, the dead man's hands tightened around her neck, and somehow she found the strength to continue. She walked until she came to the first house in the town, where the dead man bade her stop, and he sniffed the air. "I smell clean water, but I smell holy water. I cannot enter. Walk on, Mary Culhane." At the second house, again he sniffed the air. "I smell clean water, but I smell holy water. I cannot enter. Walk on, Mary Culhane." At the third house, when he sniffed the air, he said, "I smell no clean water, but I smell no holy water either. Take me inside, Mary Culhane." She took him inside and put him down by a table, and he bade her bring him something to eat and something to drink. She brought him oatmeal, but she said, "There's no clean water in the house." "Never mind," the dead man. "Bring me a razor and a small bowl." She did this. Then he climbed upon her back once more and bade her carry him upstairs. On the first room on the right, there were 3 young boys asleep in their beds. The dead man took the razor and made a cut in one finger of each of the 3 boys, and 3 drops of blood dripped into the small bowl from each finger. With the first drop of blood, their bodies became cold. With the second drop of blood, all color fled from their faces. With the third drop of blood, they stopped breathing. "That's for having no clean water in the house," the dead man. Then he bade Mary carry him downstairs, and there he mixed the blood with the oatmeal. Then he divided it into 2 portions, giving half to Mary, half for himself. "Now eat," he said, and he began to devour his portion with great relish, licking his pale lips with delight. When he wasn't looking, Mary took the scarf that was on her head and tied it around her neck and began to spoon all of her portion of the oatmeal and blood into it. Not one bite touched her lips. "Have you finished yet, Mary Culhane?" said he. "Oh, yes," said Mary, "but I must clean up so they would not know we are here." And when her back was to him, she took the scarf full of the oatmeal and blood and hid it in a cupboard, because she knew when he climbed upon her back once more, he would be able to smell it. And indeed, as soon as she had cleaned up, the dead man climbed upon her back and bade her carry him back to the graveyard. As she walked, as slowly as she dared, Mary asked, "Is there no way to save those 3 boys from death?" "None at all," said the dead man. "Oh, if a bite of the oatmeal and blood should touch their lips, 3 bites is all it would take. They would wake and nothing would have happened. But it is all eaten, and they are dead forever." They continued walking, and Mary Culhane heard the cock crowing. "Oh, it is nearly morning. I must go home." "Nay, Mary Culhane, that is not the cock crowing. That is an owl hooting. Walk on." They passed a field with 3 large stones. "Do you see those stones, Mary Culhane? Beneath each is a fortune in gold. Only the dead know this." Mary wondered, for she wasn't dead. And they walked further, and again she heard the cock crowing. "Oh, I must go home. My mother will be worried about me." "Nay, Mary Culhane, that is not the cock crowing. That is a wee lamb calling its mother. Walk on." Mary walked until she came within sight of the graveyard. She dragged her feet as much as she could, but it was an inexorable process. She got to the grave, the open grave, and the dead man said, "And now, Mary Culhane, you will come with me." And he began to pull her down, his cold, lifeless, fleshless hands pulling down her warmth. And all of a sudden, the cock crowed a 3rd time, and the dead man fell back into the grave alone. "Ah, Mary Culhane," said he, "if I had but known the cock would crow 3 times before I had you with me, I would never have told you the secrets of the dead." Mary Culhane closed his eyes, crossed his hands over his chest, picked up her father's blackthorn walking stick, and wearily made her way home. She set the stick by the fire, went in and fell into her bed, fully clothed. She was so tired. It seemed only a few minutes later that her mother was shaking her awake. "Get up, you lazy girl! How can you lie in bed like this when our neighbor's 3 sons have died in their beds this very night?" "Oh, Mother," said Mary, "look at me. I am sick unto death." And her mother looked at her, and she was as pale as the sheets. So the rest of the family left her there, and they went to comfort their neighbors. Mary slept until noon. Then she got up and had some milk warmed over the fire and some bread and honey, and then she too went to the neighbor's house. She walked right up to the parents of the 3 dead boys, and she said, "You needn't worry." "Why, you heartless girl, how can you say such a thing? Our 3 sons are dead, and they're in their beds." "No," said Mary, I only meant that I could bring them back to life." "What would you give me if I could bring them back to life?" "We would give you anything, but it is not possible." "What would you give me?" she said. "Would you possibly give me your field with the 3 stones for my own?" "Don't blaspheme, girl. It is not possible. But hypothetically," she said, "what would you give me if I could bring them back to life?" "We would give you anything, but it cannot be done." "Well, why didn't you humor me?" she said. "Write out a contract and sign it to make it legal." What could it hurt, they thought. So they wrote out a contract, and they signed it, and Mary signed it, and as soon as it was legal, she bade them all leave the house. Then she went to the kitchen cupboard where she had put the scarf with the oatmeal and blood in it, and she took a spoon and went upstairs and fed 3 bites to each of the 3 dead boys. With the first bite, their bodies became warm. With the second bite, the color returned to their faces. With the third bite, they breathed the breath of deep sleep. Mary went to the window and called the parents, "Come and wake your sons." And they all rushed upstairs and shook the boys. They sat up in bed as if nothing had happened. Then everyone crowded around Mary to see what had befallen her the night before, and she told everything except about the gold. The next week, they honored the contract and gave Mary the land with the 3 stones, and she dug up the gold. There was so much money that she could build a house with a room for every day of the year. It is also said that when she was old enough, she married the oldest of the 3 boys. It is also said that she always keeps clean water and holy water in her house, and she never, ever eats oatmeal. And that's the story of Mary Culhane and the dead man.